they can.
I don't pay attention
There you go.
to what he does.
I want to thank you for coming. We're doing it for the Zoom. We have people on Zoom. More people that are here are watching this on Zoom. So it's kind of nice. Good balance and large audience. So this morning, we have a special guest from the Buck Institute to talk to us about healthcare, but in this fact, it's called, it's a different sort of, it's health span, keeping us healthy while we're active. Okay, so welcome this morning. I'm Gary Gonzer, the president of ESCOM, and welcome to the County of Marin Libraries presentation as well as ESCOM. We go together on this, and we partner with Book Passage to get the speakers for it and to have books for sale in the back. Now, I did find out that Dr. Price will be signing books in the back after the program. So feel free. So this is a brand new library over here and a brand new building. It's not been open more than 2 months. We just opened it, I think, first of the year, and we're using it the best we can. So enjoy it. It's really modern, up to date. And as we move forward through this presentation, we have a microphone up here that will record all of our comments and our questions very clearly. So keep sidebars a little quiet, even though we're inspired to talk about the material always. So today we're honored to present Dr. Nathan Price with his new book, which is for sale in the back, The Age of Scientific Wellness, or Why the Future of Medicine is Personalized, Predictive, Data-Rich, and in Your Hands. So, okay, before we begin, Dr. Price is here. Before we begin, let me mention that ESCOM has a table in the back with Leonard Weingarten managing the table. Be sure to stop by. If you're not a member yet of ESCOM, it's easy to join. It's free. All of our events are free. And pick up some flyers. We have new brochures and new information on the table. So, plus, snacks and coffee and tea are available back of the book as well. So, let me now introduce Dave Patterson. Now, Dave Patterson is one of the librarians here in the new library that I pointed to before. It's wonderful. 2 stories of open stacks, and the students are discovering real books again.
Let's give a round of applause to Gary Gonzer. Good afternoon. Welcome to our brand new Center for Student Success, and you're all warmly welcome here and in our library, which is just down the hall. And if you voted for Measure B 10 years ago, you paid for this building, and I want to thank you. We're celebrating 100 years. This college was built, opened in 1926. And there's a beautiful 9-minute movie celebrating our centennial. And guess what it opens with? A beautiful woman named Treva Keane Strauss, who is 100 years old. And she attended College of Marin in 1943. And she still takes classes here through our community ed classes. And I'm sure Dr. Price will talk about the importance of staying active. We had the pleasure of meeting her in the library last week. Sharp as a tack, full of humor and life. And I think that's what we all hope for. I think that's why we're here, Dr. Price, to hear what's the ticket to that. We're grateful to Book Passage. And Allison, can you wave back there? Allison, let's give her a round of applause. She's selling books. I love Book Passage. I like to say the best bookstore in the world, and they've helped us with this series every year for over a decade. We're so excited to have ESCOM as our partner and Community Ed. And now I'd like to introduce Dr. Price. Dr. Nathan Price has two primary roles: professor and co-director of the Center for Human Healthspan at the Buck Institute for Research on Aging, and chief scientific officer of Thorne, a healthy aging company that serves 7 million plus customers and 47,000 healthcare practitioners. He's the co-author with Lee Hood of this book, The Art of Scientific Wellness. And as a librarian, I just have to say it's so exciting to be presenting a book that was published by Harvard Press. We've never done that before. It's just whenever I see something from Harvard, I'm already halfway sold on it. So he has published over 200 scientific publications, as well as articles in the Wall Street Journal, the LA Times, Big Think, Scientific American, and others. A frequent speaker, he's given over 250 invited talks and keynotes. In 2019, he was named as one of the 10 emerging leaders in health and medicine by the National Academy of Medicine. And in 2021, he was appointed to the Board on Life Sciences of the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine. He's also the 2023 recipient of the Alexander and Mildred Seelig Award for Science from the American Nutrition Association. Please welcome Dr. Nathan Price.
Thank you for that kind introduction. It's wonderful to be here with everyone. So I'm going to talk today a little bit about the age of scientific wellness, and what do I mean by that? And so when we think, when Lee and I were really imagining this space, or when I got into this, I had started primarily as a researcher in a pretty typical vein. Cancer researcher, fellowship from the American Cancer Society. My first NIH grants were in cancer. We were doing some work in Alzheimer's. Did that for, I don't know, 6 or 7 years perhaps. But during all that period, I started to really feel like we intervene much too late in these diseases, and that we need to think a lot more about what is happening very early on, and how do we extend health span rather than waiting until things are quite well advanced. It was interesting, right before the pandemic, I was on a panel with the chairman emeritus of Harvard Medical School, and he put this in a way that I really liked, which is healthcare is the only industry that does not study its own gold standard, which is wellness. And so we had started really building a repertoire, as I'll talk to you about, of a lot of data collected during the wellness period. He was a fan of that work, which was how we got connected, which was terrific. And this is something that people have been thinking about for a long time. So I was on my way to give an address at RPI, a university in upstate New York. And I was driving up there and I was listening to a book, trying to stay abreast of the latest material. Slightly behind, this is a book that's about 2,000 years old. It's called The Moral Epistles by Seneca the Younger. And just by coincidence, as I was heading up to give this talk, the next one up, number 53 or whatever it was, rolls up on longevity. I thought, oh, this is interesting. What were people thinking about longevity 2,000 years ago? And it turns out Seneca was thinking of something quite similar, which is he had this quote that I really loved, which was, "For it makes a great deal of difference whether a man is lengthening his life or his death." And I thought that was just an incredible way to put it, that for each of us, right, as we think about our own lives, there's that notion of extending your life versus extending your death. And as I really got into be an aging researcher, it was so fascinating to me how often people would come up and say, "Oh, this is fantastic. This is the greatest thing you could study." And other people would be, "This is terrible. Why do you do this?" And it was really that dichotomy of, if you're imagining that lengthening of your life in terms of that period in which you're healthy, or the lengthening of death, which is that period that comes after. So one of the aspects of the moment that we're living in now that is on a lot of our minds is AI. This is sort of our moment in history, the birth of AI, these new technologies. And I did write this piece for the Wall Street Journal a couple of years ago, along with Lee, that basically says, is an argument that one of the greatest benefits that we could derive from AI, that's the positive side here at the moment, is an abundance of health. And how do we get to that? Now, one of the things that's really of interest as we contemplate this space right now is that there are certain aspects of what we need to drive health forward that are getting exponentially better, like radically better. Our ability to mine data out of literature is exponentially faster. I'll tell you a little more about that. Our ability to search for configurations of drugs, exponentially better. Anyway, and on and on. There's a whole bunch of things like this. But there are other aspects of those pipelines that are not going up exponentially, like the ability to do safety trials in people, for example. And so one of the issues that comes up a lot right now is how do we harness the aspects that are getting better at such a radical pace in order to help those areas that are moving slowly so that we start to see an exponential type improvement in the prevention of all the kind of things that we want to see gone, right? Cancers, Alzheimer's disease, and so forth. So we're spending a lot of time working on these kind of things. So I want to also talk a little bit about what is aging from the standpoint of what I'll talk about today. And so aging in this context is not merely the passage of time, right? We can all think about that, what's marked by our birthdays. But in this case, what we're looking at is that for every year that you get older, the likelihood of dying from a whole host of different things is ticking up. And I remember this lecture that I had when I was an engineering undergraduate many, many years ago. And I don't know why this one's stuck to me. I probably couldn't name one other lecture that happened during that whole year, but this one I remember, this anecdote, which was that light bulbs don't age. And I always thought this was an interesting comment, right? So when someone says a light bulb doesn't age, what do we mean by that? And so if you have a light bulb, and I'm talking about the old incandescent light bulbs, right? You've got a copper filament, electrons flow through there. That copper filament is not wearing out as the electrons go through. So when a light bulb blows up, it is a function of a surge on the electrical grid. So it's just as likely to blow out on day one as it is on day 35,001. And so because the odds of it, of it blowing out are level, we say it doesn't age. And so that's the difference between us and the light bulb, as shown there on the slide, is just that basically, right, that year over year, it's going up. And so from that standpoint, what we're really thinking about is that we want to take those curves and basically press them downward. So to the degree we say, are we solving aging, would mean that when we plot these in the decades as we go forward, that slope is going down, that we're pushing it as much as possible towards level so that you're not so dramatically more likely to die of things when you're in your 60s and 70s than you were in your 30s and 40s. And that's really the hope or the aspirational goal of people that work in the aging space. I already talked about this to some degree, right? There's this separation between health span, which is the time of your life that you live in really good health, and lifespan, which goes all the way till when you die. And the idea is to try to compress, and there's that Seneca quote, and then is to try to compress that time at the end of life where we're in decline, and to try to extend as much as possible that time that we have when we're vibrant and healthy and feeling as good as we can for as long as possible. If we think about this in the notion of healthcare, this leads to something that is quite different than we've thought about before. So we think about something that would look like Healthspan medicine. So it's worthwhile, and I talk about this in the book, to think about how we came to what we call modern medicine. So if you go back into the early 1900s, the world was very different from now when we think about disease and health. It's a morbid statistic, but I'll share it. The early 1900s is an era in which 1 in 3 coffins is filled with the body of a child who has died from an infectious disease. So if we were living, back 100 and some odd years ago, we can all collectively think about our children. A whole big fraction of them would be dead in childhood. That was the world, and that was the world as you go back, right, millennia. That was the world up until we brought science into medicine, And this was done through initially through Abraham Flexner, who did this thing called the Flexner Report, bringing that in, systematized science. And we started to do public health. So clean drinking water, sanitary conditions, vaccines, antibiotics, things of this nature. And we attacked infectious disease in a major way. And we were incredibly successful at that by virtue of the fact that we no longer live in that world. In fact, you go back to the top 5 things that were killing us in the early 1900s, and they're barely a blip today. We basically don't think about them hardly at all. Now, if we fast forward to now and we think about our modern scourges, which are primarily chronic disease, cancers, Alzheimer's, diabetes, heart disease, all the things that we typically die from. And our success in eradicating chronic disease is nothing like the success that we had in infectious disease. I would argue we have, as of yet, with all of our progress and all of the things that we have done we have never relegated to the dustbin of history a chronic disease. If you think I'm wrong about that or have an example, please share that with me. I'll be very happy to know that. And so one of the arguments is that we took a paradigm, which was find the pathogen, find the bug, that causal agent, and kill it. And we turned that into find the target and drug it. And yet these diseases are mostly too complex for that. Those can have alleviating issues, but they're not likely to be the solution. So we really need to understand much more from a systems point of view, what is it that keeps us healthy and how do we maintain that, as opposed to trying to only focus in disease manifestation in late stage. So one of the ancillaries of that is, we just wrote this article with the title here, we wait for disease to shout. What if we listen when biology whispers? And so that is something that I think is really at the heart of everything we do, which is to try to measure very subtle signals in an individual's body, compared against them in time, so that you can see what are the things that are changing and interpret those subtle signals so we can try to locate ourselves as closely to ongoing health in years and decades before problems manifest. So don't wait for a terrible symptom. You may have had this experience. My wife did. She was starting to notice some of the biomarkers that she was measuring and her genetic risk profile was worried for a thyroid disease. So she goes into a thyroid specialist and says, okay, I'm starting to see this drift that's going towards a place I don't want to go. Not an acute problem yet, but what can I do to be helpful here? He was very dismissive towards her, started to explain to her how to try to understand that data can be confusing. She's a PhD biostatistician who works. She's pretty smart. And she tried to share that fact, but he was uninterested in the notion that she actually knew something about data analysis a lot more than he did. And he said, well, wait until you have these terrible symptoms and then come back and I'll give you this drug. So I wrote this book. So one of the great examples of this, I think, in the scientific literature, and it's indicative of how much science is actually changing and embracing prevention and wellness in a way that they really didn't when we started doing this about 15 years ago, is Alzheimer's disease. So in the early days when people started getting genetics, and if I saw this repeated in the literature, or not in the literature, in the news media thousands of times, they would say, don't go get your genome done because you'll find out you have high risk for Alzheimer's disease and there's nothing you can do. I must have read that thousands of times. And that's actually nonsense and not true. There is no drug, and certainly at the time there wasn't. There are a couple of pharmaceutical drugs now that are approved for treatment of Alzheimer's and late stage disease. Happy that those exist, but their effect sizes are small and their costs are big, and their side effects are big as well. So we have not had anything like a real success. I wrote this piece for the LA Times here, and there's different estimates of this. So it's at least tens of billions of dollars, median estimate somewhere in the low hundreds of billions of dollars. I saw one estimate as high as $1 trillion that have been spent cumulatively over the decades on trying to develop a late stage treatment that's effective for Alzheimer's disease. And we have almost nothing to show for that. Now, at the same time, if you're thinking about prevention, and it's actually estimated, it depends partly on your genetic background. So if you look at one population, take the Hispanic population in the United States, estimated that 45% of all dementia in that population is preventable by lifestyle intervention, which is a big number. Now, they have a particularly high ability to do that because they are not so genetically driven by things like ApoE4, which is this gene that gives you high risk for Alzheimer's. So it depends on the population, but you have a lot on the table. The two most successful trials that I would argue have ever existed in Alzheimer's disease, one is called the FINGER study. This was done some years ago. We talk about it in the book. And it goes through lifestyle interventions, diet, supplements, exercise, things like this that people do. And you can get a delay in the onset of dementia. This was just replicated as well this last summer in what's called the Pointer study. So the first study was called the FINGER study, in part because it was done in Finland. This one is done in the United States. So you have the ability to be able to do this from a prevention standpoint. And so when we do this, and I was one of 3 keynote speakers for combinatorial interventions for Alzheimer's disease. And it was so interesting because the first talk was a pharma talk, very professional, great statistics that showed, right, that small effect size and big cost. The second, though, keynote was from a woman named Laura Baker, who led the Pointer study. Actually, she's on our scientific advisory board at Thorne now, which I'm excited about too. So we work with her. And basically, it then reiterated that there are all kinds of things that you can do in order to prevent the onset of dementia. And I'll mention a few of them, and you can read about them in the LA Times article as well. So exercise, right, makes a difference, not surprisingly. Turns out one of the big things you need to do is to maintain blood flow to your brain, right? So exercise, sauna usage. People that use sauna 4 to 7 times a week for about 15 minutes or so, they get dementia at 60% of the rate of other individuals. That's observational, so there's some elements to that, but that's a big number. And by the way, as another corollary, it's 50% lower in cardiovascular disease. So that's partly because it has an effect on keeping your blood vessels a little more limber. So doing that makes a big difference. There are certain nutrients that seem to make a difference. So we did these really deep digital twin models of Alzheimer's, of brain health, and then you put on certain Alzheimer's risk factors and so forth. One of the nutrients that becomes rate limiting as your neurons start to die from not having enough energy as you get older, as that perfusion of oxygen in your brain gets worse, that nutrient is choline. So that's in eggs, right? So choline in eggs. You can also supplement with this nutrient called phosphatidylcholine. And that is an element that you'll want to watch for because that lack of that nutrient can become a rate limiting step, right? This is another thing when I'll talk a little bit, sometimes about, supplements or lifestyle behaviors or things of this nature, is that on a one-off basis, none of these things is like sufficient to be preventive to Alzheimer's, right? You can eat a lot of choline and still get Alzheimer's disease, but it's one facet of the piece that you're solving. When we did these really deep digital twin simulations of this, we would find that you could take interventions that one by one, if you test them in isolation, you would find unless you did a huge sample size, you would not get a signal, but you start putting them together in personalized combinations and the model starts predicting years of benefit. So there's sort of 2 sides to things that you have to think of. One is, what do we have evidence for, in a big, RCT or a big clinical trial on a 1-by-1? But the flip side is that what can you do in a combinatorial or deep way on your own biology and your own journey? And that's going to make really a big difference. I'm going to talk just a little bit about economics here for a moment. So this was very interesting. So when Lee Hood and I started doing this work about 15 years ago or so, there was not a lot of interest in wellness out there in the big world in terms of healthcare. There's always been interest in wellness, like in other ways, but in healthcare, it didn't so much get into this. And so this was a very interesting forecasting report by Deloitte. And you may or may not be aware of Deloitte, probably depends how much you were in the corporate world. Deloitte is a big industry consulting firm. They do forecasts of industries and sort of where they're going and things like this that quite a few people in that space pay attention to. So in 2022, they came around and they started to forecast that from where we are right now, which you can see the size of these bubbles here, we spend most of our $4 trillion a year, which is what we spend on healthcare in the United States. We spend most of that on treatment after illness. And what they're forecasting is that a shift by 2040 to where there's now a lot of that money going up towards restoring health, promoting and restoring health, which is there at the top. And so I started calling this the $2 trillion pivot because we're talking about that scale of shift that they're projecting in terms of healthcare and how it's shifting upstream more towards a wellness model, right? Which, of course, we were very excited about because it's something we've been advocating for a long time. Now, if you buy into that at all, what that means then is that we actually have tailwinds in this area for people who are building companies, building solutions, driving towards what I think will become a much better approach to how we want to handle healthcare in the future. And so this is something that I am very excited about because if you're just talking about certain things and there aren't economic alignments behind it, it really has little chance of growing massively in the world. And what we see now is that alignment has started to happen. And so you're seeing big pushes where this is the level of interest today, for example, compared to a decade ago is just light years different. And so we're seeing lots and lots of push in this direction now. I also wrote this piece for Scientific American that goes through the emergence of this industry. So evidence-based wellness emerges as an industry. Goes through about like 50 or so companies that have emerged or started from the time that I did that. There's been so many more that have come out since. Okay. So here's an argument that I'll also make that AI's greatest opportunity in health isn't disease, it's wellness. And the reason I argue for that is because, again, it's that slope of the aging line that we want to turn it down. And that what we want to do is to learn those whispers, those small, subtle measures that you can measure in your biology and try to extend life for as much as possible. Also, a small shameless plug there, I guess, that my TED Talk came out a couple weeks ago. So if you want to see that, it is online now. Okay, so we've talked about a lot of big picture pieces. So in 2013, Lee Hood and I started thinking a lot about this area of scientific wellness, and we wanted to turn that into something that was a little more tangible. So we started something called the Pioneer 100, which we then scaled up to about 5,000 people that we monitored over the course of about 4 years so that we would have some significant deep data along the course of the wellness to disease transitions. And so we made a whole bunch of measurements. So one, we did whole genome sequencing on everybody. So that gave us millions of differences on just base pair differences between different people. We measured about 1,200 different analytes out of the blood. So these were proteins, which make up the molecular machinery of your cells, metabolites, so small molecules, nutrients or toxins, and about 100 or so different clinical lab tests that your doctor might do. And we were doing those multiple times per year. We were also measuring gut microbiome. So these are these species of microbes, bacteria and archaea and eukaryotes that exist in your gut, and primarily. They also exist all over your skin and in your mouth. Basically, it's an envelope that mediates between your body and your environment pretty much in every way. Then we looked at continual self-tracking. So this is wearable devices, Fitbits, Whoop, Apple, Apple Watch, whatever we want to use these days. The database of actionable possibilities. The idea being that if we could help someone with their health today, they'd stay with us. And then over time, we create what we call personal, dense, dynamic data clouds, or deep phenotyping. So the idea is that the more levels of data you get on the same individuals, the more you can figure out about how all those pieces fit together. And I'm just going to walk you through a few examples. I'll try not to get too bogged down in all the science pieces that I love, but I just want to give you some headlines here about some of the things that we learned from studying for the first time ever a lot of these deep measurements on thousands of individuals. Okay, so what did we learn from this? And I'll start with the microbiome. So New York Times picked up one of our papers, so I'll just use their icon here. But basically, one of the things we saw was that as you get older, starting about age 50, if you stay healthy, your microbiome starts looking less and less like anyone else's microbiome. So they're all starting to drift apart. So if you get ill, which we defined as you were hospitalized or on more than 5 pharmaceuticals, we did not see that happen. But if you stayed reasonably healthy through life, what we saw was that your microbiome is increasingly tuned exactly to you. And it starts looking less and less like anyone else's. So we thought that was quite an interesting thing. That was supported by a Catalyst Award from the National Academy of Medicine, and we published the details of that, if any scientists are in the room, in Nature Metabolism. So another interesting question was people would go through a wellness program, some people lost weight and some people didn't. So what was different about people who went on to lose weight? And so we went to a baseline and we had all of this, tons of data that I told you about. And we went back, we controlled for BMI, right? So just your body mass index. So how overweight a person was itself a predictor, of course. But once we controlled for that, I was quite surprised by this. We took a bunch of advanced machine learning approaches and tried to say, was there a signal in those hundreds of proteins that we measured? And we couldn't find one. We tried to see if there was a signal in those hundreds of metabolites that we had measured. I was really surprised by this, but it was not true. We tried to see if there was a signal in what people told us they were going to eat. No. So that did not predict. That actually trended a little bit higher, but asking people what they were going to eat wasn't predictive, actually. The only thing that was predictive of who would go on to lose weight in this cohort was the microbiome. And there was one overriding factor that made the most difference, and that was the genes that made up the microbiome. And so what this was is, so let's say you eat a sweet potato. So if you have a certain kind of microbiome, it'll be more likely to break that into simple sugars. If it does that, that's going to spike insulin more, much harder to lose weight. Other people, however, will have a microbiome that will break down that complex carbohydrates more into short-chain fatty acids. This includes something called butyrate, which is kind of the most well-studied, health-promoting one of these short-chain fatty acids. And we know now, one of the things that does, it stimulates GLP-1. So if you have a certain kind of microbiome, you have this kind of, and this is why there's been the emergence of GLP-1 probiotics, right? Pendulum Cell's one of these. Those GLP-1 probiotics, and to be clear, the effect size on the microbiome is not like the effect size of the drug, right? The drug is a modified form that is much, much more potent. But it is true that if you have a certain kind of microbiome, you will have low-level stimulating effects that are pretty much on all the time. And so that was an interesting discovery. And we found that in our cohort, that was by far the strongest signal that we could find when someone came at baseline of being able to predict whether or not they would go on to lose weight by going through a personalized wellness program. Okay, so another thing we can do is we can evaluate metabolic health in deeper ways. So we published a paper. This is in Nature Medicine, which is one of the top medicine journals in the world. We published this in 2023. And what it did is it said, okay, if you get a BMI measure, which is just a measure of your weight, weight to height, basically, that's an okay population measure. It's not that great for a specific person. You could have, an individual that has a ton of muscle, right? They'd have a high BMI, but they're not metabolically unhealthy. And there are quite a big differences in the metabolic health based on this. So we took all that deep data and we developed a measure that was correlated with BMI, but that gave much deeper insight into how metabolically healthy a person was given at that weight. And so we're able to divine that into score. And I'm going to show you a little bit more about that here in a moment. And then another piece that we were able to show is that your microbes actually have a big impact on drugs. And this is quite underappreciated and actually not that well studied, certainly by the pharma companies, because they don't have at least so far, I haven't been able to get them to be convinced that they have a great financial interest in this. But basically, what we looked at first, just because it's the most common in our population, was statins. And so we took microbiomes, we just grouped them into 4 different groups. And one thing that became pretty striking, which is shown there at the bottom, is for one of these types of microbiomes, we saw an apparent doubling of the lowering of LDL cholesterol from the same statins that we saw in other parts of the population. So that's a huge signal. That's much larger than the effect of any known human genomic variant, for example. So that was quite interesting. The other thing that we saw was that one of the downsides of statins is that you get a 9% increase in the rate of diabetes among statin users. And so it's like most things in biology and medicine, it's almost always trade-offs. That's an interesting avenue we could go down. But there are trade-offs typically. And what this showed, though, is that when we looked in this population to see who had elevated diabetes markers from the statin associated with the statin usage, we only saw that happen in 2 types of microbiomes and not in the other 2. So early study, first indication of this, but it was indicative that there are likely to be very many interactions between the microbiome and drug efficacy and drug side effect profile. And in fact, we actually know from other people's work, as a first estimate, about 13% of drugs are metabolized away by the microbiome, right? It eats it and turns it into something else. So it's an incredibly important area. By the way, just to be equal on this, that can also be true of supplements, for example. I mentioned phosphatidylcholine earlier as something that may be beneficial for brain health. If you have certain microbes in your gut, they will eat phosphatidylcholine, turn it into something called trimethylamine, which your liver then turns into TMAO. It's a risk factor for heart attacks, for coronary artery disease. I'm setting up some of this because there's some complexity here in terms of the things that you might want to get into. So for one person, you could be taking, again, the same pill, right? RCT, studied, understand, we know it, it's all great. And it can be terrific for one person and bad for another. And that's the kind of thing that is not captured as long as we keep medicine focused on averages. There's a great book, if you haven't read it, by Todd Rose called The End of Average, I believe. Is that right? Someone correct me. I think that's right. There's so many The End of books that I'm starting to doubt myself. But but basically, average does not exist. There's all kinds of super interesting stories about that, but I won't take the time here. Okay, so another area of lesson that we can go through here is around biological age. So biological age is basically the age that your body says that you are, as opposed to the age of the calendar. It's a little bit of a catch-all. There are certain aspects of biological age, particularly the epigenetic ages, that are used quite a lot commercially that have very high variability to them. So there's some papers on that as well. But I want to talk about one aspect of this still. So we use this as a metric to just take those big cloud of data points, all these measures we were making on these thousands of people, And you ask that simple question, right? If all I saw was your measurement, how old would I say that you are, right? That's basically a biological age, just an estimate. And so when we did that, this is what that big cloud of points looks like. We won't go through the details here, other than we use this particular algorithm. It's called the Clamara-Duval algorithm. And the only thing I want you to know about it that's important is that it does this mathematical transformation such that we force the line that we fit to be very close to 1. So the take home there is just, this is a measure which is expected to tick up 1 year per year. It's built into the math of how it's done. That turns out to be important if you want to track it over time. So you can always fit a line to a curve. Doesn't mean it's meaningful in any way. So we wanted to just do a sanity check on this and ask the question, if we look at people's biological age versus chronologic age, how was that associated to disease that we saw in this population of thousands of people? And so the only thing I want you to notice here are the asterisks, right, that you see up there. And what I want you to notice is that the asterisk there, in every single case of these 40 or so diseases that I have up here, in every case, it's on the right side of the line. Meaning that in every single case where we saw a statistically significant signal, disease was associated with higher biological age. And we saw 0 cases, we saw no examples of a disease where it was associated with having a lower biological age. So that was a first sanity check, just to say that at least according to the measures that we did, and this, by the way, is 4 different biological age calculations, one based on proteins in the blood, one based on metabolites in the blood, one based on the about 100 or so clinical labs that we had, and one that was a combination of being able to use all the data together. And so that's what's shown there. Now, perhaps even more interestingly, at least to me, was as people were going through these personalized wellness programs that we were running at the time, we wanted to go back and say, did this biological age estimate change as they were going through and trying to get healthier? And what we saw, in fact, was that the answer to that was yes. So that vertical blue line there is showing the expectation, which is that you go up by 1 year per year. And then on average in the population, what we saw was that there was a negative 0.16 change in biological age per year. So that meant they were getting better compared to chronological age at a rate of 1.16 years per year. Women did particularly well, going down 1.5 years per year. And men did not as well, but still well, where they were getting better at a rate of 0.8 years per year, meaning they were going up 1 unit of biological age per 5 years. Now, before we get carried away with this, I want to point out the further your biological age gets below your chronologic age, the harder it is to move, right? This works within a window. You can do it for a while. This doesn't persist forever or anything like that, right? But it's just a measure that we should use that I think is useful, though, to think about from the standpoint of monitoring global changes in biomarkers. So it's what we'd call a metric for wellness. All right, so not to be overinterpreted, but a pretty interesting result. Okay. All right. Final thing that how are we doing on time, by the way? I have no clock.
10 minutes to 2. So this is usually when we take questions and answers, but I think we're all very excited. Keep going.
Right,
How about another 5 or 10?
Okay, that sounds good then. All right, I'll tell you just a little bit about this, and I want to talk about AI system to end it. So there was this interesting paper that came out. So about half of your lifespan is heritable by genetics, and about half is lifestyle. So one of the things that I want to talk about, although there's a little bit of a paradox in there, which I won't get into too much here, which is just that the better we understand your genetics, the more we can tell precisely what's going on in lifestyle that's having an effect. So even the fact that we say that half is heritable, that means as we look retrospectively, right, that half of that was predictable by the genome. I think that the more we understand the genome, the better we can do health span optimization going forward. So I think the more that we get better and better genomic signals, that doesn't mean that we're losing the ability to make modifications. I actually think it increases our ability to do so. So let's just look at a particular biomarker here. So LDL cholesterol. I'm guessing that pretty much everyone's had their LDL cholesterol measured at some point. It's a very, very common biomarker. And what I'm showing here is just here on the bottom, we've developed a polygenic, what's called a polygenic risk score. This basically just predicts from your genome what I think is the likely level of LDL cholesterol in your blood. That means I don't know anything about your diet, your life history, nothing. Your genome predicts, at the time of this paper, about 12% of the variance. Now, just to give you a sense, just in the last 4 or 5 years since this paper, we can now predict 21%. So it's gotten a lot better. But all I want you to notice here is that that line is pretty, well, that if you do that, it kind of forms a line, right? So we can predict something about your genetics of LDL cholesterol. Now, the question is, does that matter? Because clinically, your doctor, this is Marin, so maybe a couple, you will have an exception to this, but to a first approximation, doctors don't use genetics for the interpretation of blood markers like LDL at all. Should they? So we took people through this wellness program, and again, we wanted to see who lowered LDL cholesterol by lifestyle. And it turns out you can predict that in advance from the genome. Okay, so for people whose genome would predict them to be low, we saw that they lower their LDL cholesterol very substantially. Whereas people there on the right whose genome predicted high, we saw no statistically significant ability for them to lower it at all. So totally predictable from their genome in advance. And so you can say who might see a biomarker change and who won't. And so, so just to make that a little more clear, so two individuals, right, they have both the same high range, but their genome predicts one high and one low. That means they have differences in gaps. So essentially, we're just decomposing the part that is unalterable, right, that's genetic, from the part that's lifestyle that they can do something about. Okay, so now I just want to go into the last thing that I want to talk about today, which is I presented a fair bit of complexity in terms of what's going on in your body. And there's a ton of complexity, and this is a relatively simplified view of that. And that's why I think that these AI systems for Healthspan are so interesting, because we can take a lot of that complexity, which would be hard to just remember, including for myself, right? Remember it all. What was this? What did that gene do? What about that microbe, et cetera, et cetera? And we can put those all into personalized systems and make that available to anybody in plain English at the touch of a button. So we have an incredible amount of data gathered right now. A number of people probably wearing wearables and things like this. 500 billion data points are gathered every day right now. So a huge amount. That's forecasted to become over 2 trillion a day by 2040. And I think, and you'll notice that's above, the 2 trillion is quite a conservative estimate of that. So we've come up with a program that we're running out of the box called Healthspan Horizons. And what this program is aimed at is to build that same type of really deep data that I've just told you about at much larger scale by partnering with all these different groups and people that come in and sign up for this program, to contribute in data that's being collected from wearables or blood measures or so forth. And then we would gather an extra vial of blood when those come in and measure proteomes and metabolomes and methylate, all these like different depths of data in order to drive forward discovery around human health span, all privacy preserving, all anonymized data, with the goal of making health span measurable, predictable, and reliably modifiable, right? So that's really what we want to do. So we built 2 AI systems, one of which I'm going to show you just to finish up today. That one's called Compass, which is a personalized health guidance system. I'll walk you through that. So that's what we can say for an individual, given an individual's data. And then we've also done Synthesizer, which basically takes all of the anonymized data that we get and tries to learn new signals, right? And I walked you through some of the things we learned, right, about the microbiome and biological age and so forth, and genetics predicting lifestyle outcomes and things of that nature. So the point of Synthesizer is every one of those papers that I walked you through very quickly, it's like a year or two of effort from a grad student or a postdoc, right? This is a challenging amount. But with the modern AI systems, we can set up systems to do those analyses automated every night. In fact, we can run 100 of them a night because it's just parallel compute, right? You can just scale it up. And so they're not as smart yet, but they are getting smarter very, very rapidly. So like my research group has pretty much transitioned 100% away from like running detailed computational analyses ourselves of the type we've talked about into building agentic AI systems that can handle whole classes of problems because we can now move 100 times faster than we could for all the things that I just showed you. Okay, so I'm just going to showcase a little bit of this system here, just to give a sense for what this looks like. Okay, so here's what we can do, and I apologize the text a little bit small there, but it was as good as I could do at the moment. Or there's some way to make this bigger, actually. Let me see if this will work. Okay, so every picture and name that you see here is, of course, not real. The data that you will see is from a real person, but identity is, this is definitely not David. That is, and these are AI composite figures, so it's not an actual person. Okay, so I just want to be clear about privacy on this. But I'm just going to walk you through an example of what can we say about a person's data. So this is David. He's 53 years old, here in California. That is actually true of the real person, but that's not a very big clue. And I don't know who it is. I just know a little bit of demographic data. So David is one of the earliest Healthspan Compass participants. So we learn a little bit about him. So he walks daily, lifts twice a week, follows a Mediterranean-style diet, puts in some goals here, right, of things that he wants to do, and some health concerns that he has. And so we're going to start a guided tour here in terms of what we could do with data. So he's gone through this health program that I showed you before. So I'll walk through the guided demo. So this just sets up a series of questions that we'll go through. So the first is we're just going to ask, what does my health look like today? And so you can do this, of course, in ChatGPT or Claude. So what this does is it's going to add a computation layer to this. So it recognizes that he wants to know something about his health. So it goes in, it starts to generate plots for all of his different clinical labs and then put them onto known ranges. So in this case, he can see sort of where he's at on different markers and so forth. So that's available. A lot of people will do something like that. So the next question, I'm just doing the yeses to make this faster, is should we do a peer comparison? So I've asked it now to just say, how does David compare against other people that are around his same age? So it goes into the thousands of people for whom we've generated data, and it starts to generate a background distribution, which you see there. So it keeps that desired clinical range. You can see where he's at and see that he is, not only is he out of range, but he's actually below average in this case for a person his age. Go ahead, click over here and look at people who are 10 years older. He's basically what you would expect him to be at if he were 10 years older. He probably doesn't love that. Maybe he wants to work on that. And you can do that for any of these different biomarkers, both the ones he's good at and the ones that he's not. So the next thing I want to showcase here, though, that I'm very excited about is now I'm asking it to compare his markers against his genetic potential. So this is that science that I showed you, that we were the first group in the world to show that you could predict the outcome of these lifestyle interventions from genome. But that's not used in the clinic, right? I also made that point. And partly that is because there isn't an easy tool for a doctor or a person to have access to that information. Well, now we have that. And for what it's worth, my research group is the first group in the United States now that has access to the 1 million genomes of the Emirati in the UAE. So we're actually building out this capability for their population now as well. They've actually sequenced all 1 million of their citizens pretty remarkably. So here we have HDL cholesterol, right? So it's low. His genome predicts that it should be up here in the good zone. And so there's room. So this is opportunities, right? So it just highlights, and I won't take the time to go through all of it, but basically it says, here's all the areas where we think your body will work with you rather than against you. Here's the space. You'll see he's beating his genes very significantly on LDL cholesterol. You won't be surprised that that is because he's on a statin. In fact, before statin, it was pretty much right in the genetically predicted range, and then he hammered it down with a statin. Probably the right thing to do in that case, right? He was not likely to move it down by lifestyle. If we have really deep data of the kind that I mentioned, I'm going to now have this go through, and this will compute things like the multiple biological age scores I mentioned, the biological BMI score. It's going to do a very limited amount of microbiome. We haven't built that part of the system out terribly much yet, but it will, yeah, it's churning there. And you'll see that when I ask it a question, it recognizes the syntax of the question, and that's what gets the system to then go do the calculation, the modules, the skills that we've taught it. So in his case, he's 53, right? But his biological age, 56. His reported BMI is 27.6. He's actually, we would predict, metabolically more unhealthy than his weight would suggest. So that highlights that for him and microbiome diversity. And then just to close up here, although actually, I take it back. There's a couple more things. So that then rolls through so we can get this deeper information. So then another piece we can look at is to monitor this over time, right? So we can look at progress over time. So in this case, right, hemoglobin's getting better. And you can do this for all kinds of different markers, everything in there. And then we actually just hired a fantastic guy out of the Environmental Protection Agency who's joined the lab, and he's building out all kinds of new environmental markers for us. And so we can layer on their exposure to ozone or particulate matter or smoke or whatever, and they can dive into that even geographically. So this asks the question then about check environmental exposures and context, and what this will do is then just delve into that a little bit more. Let's see here. Okay. And so you get a map. I just want to get to the last page here. So this will give a map then of exposures across the country to anything that he's like, so he can delve in and observe that to the extent that he wants to. So we're trying to layer in as much contextual information as possible as we build this system out. And so here's what the final page looks like for him then. He has he's 53. This is his predicted risk window. So this is when we start to think that there might be some serious disease issues. He's got a healthy range here, BMI, right? His BMI is elevated. Metabolically, looks like he's even worse. This is a reminder of that. Let's see if I can get that on the screen there. It tells him why it matters for disease. Recaps for him all the areas based on his genome that we think would be the highest leverage points to do. And then you can go through, and as he starts clicking on things, this will start to shift, right? The prediction window of how much benefit do we think he would get from, as he starts to add more and more pieces here. And then the only thing I'll add here, since you can't read this because it's too small. So it says at the top here, replace refined carbs and legumes, intact grains and vegetables. That's relatively generic. That's good advice. But below it, it says your insulin dropped from 27.8 to 14.9 so far on the program. So it gives some context. There's a major win, which it is, but your DNA says it should sit around 9.4. So that remaining gap is, and so the point being, it will actually contextualize all of these things very specifically and get richer and richer over time through use. And I won't go through the rest of the little bit of what's there. So basically, the idea here is that as individuals want to come in and participate with this program, we're going to make this available to people. So the idea, that I just want to close with here is that few problems touch every life. Healthspan optimization is one of those. And so if you're interested in staying up with what we're doing, you can go to healthspanhorizons.org, which you should also get from that QR code if it isn't, if this still working. Or healthspanhorizons.org, which is the URL there. If you're interested in this, you can sign up just an email. And we send out monthly content about things that we're learning in case you're interested in that. And also it would let you know when this when the AI system becomes live on the website if you want to try it out. And with that, happy to take any questions. Thank you.
I think Larry has a microphone. So who has a question? And maybe Mateus can tell us if anyone has a question online.
Hi, the microbiome is very important. I could tell from your talk. How do you find out how healthy yours is? Is it blood tests, or it seems one of those areas that might be hard to diagnose?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of truth to that. So there's a variety of consumer tests that are out there. These are not like tests that your doctor would give you, so they are a little bit exploratory, and there are debates about usefulness in that area. I'm quite a big fan of them. I've done them quite often myself. I think it's quite interesting to see what's in there. It is, there some of the companies, like there's a company called Tiny Health that's doing these. There's one called I want to say Kona, which I think there are a couple groups that we're talking with that have microbiome tests. So you can dive in, you can evaluate like species that you're in. There's a number of things you can do. So one is, let's say you're taking probiotics, you want to know, is it actually changing your microbiome? You can monitor for those kind of things. A lot of vitamins, like B vitamins, for example, are synthesized in the gut microbiome. So you can evaluate whether or not you have gene content that would suggest that you're getting an adequate amount of those. You can, of course, also do that in the blood. I am a big believer that a blood test for the microbiome is actually going to be an important thing. I don't believe they exist yet, but I did show that there was a very tight, I guess I didn't go into it as much as I usually do. I dropped some slides off, but there's a very tight connection between the microbiome and small molecules that appear in your blood. And so a lot of the time you can get a pretty reasonable readout of if your microbiome is healthy by looking at those metabolites. Like, are you getting, in other words, are they butyrate? Are you getting indoles that you can see in your blood? If you're seeing TMAO, that's a problem. So there's a lot to dive in. It is not yet you should go into it from the standpoint of a little bit of an explorer and a little bit that you've got to piece together information. But I think the consumer tests are getting better. And like I said, I do enjoy doing them.
Are you all right? Ready to talk about? Rather comprehensive. So you have a program that we as individuals can join up at the Buck Institute.
That's right. That we're just launching. It'll launch hopefully this fall.
And the program would cause how much time would be involved to be a full enlistee?
I mean, at the moment, the way Healthspan Horizons is set up, it's really dependent on you, because it's literally as it gets launched, it's literally signing up, uploading data that you are collecting via what you're doing into from wearables or health data and so forth, and then just playing with the AI system as you want to. So it doesn't require on-site time or anything like that at the moment.
How much money will this cost?
We're still working that out. I mean, I think for the AI system, it will be either nothing or nominal. I don't know that I have enough money to pay for like compute for a lot of people that come in and use it. So I will either need a grant or, maybe there would be a charge for the compute time or something like that. But what's that, $20?
And then perhaps my last question, thankfully for the audience. This seems to be aimed for middle-aged people to develop information about what the body has and how you interpret it and what your recommendations are. And for someone like me, who's my late 80s, it doesn't really have perhaps as much usefulness.
I don't know that I would agree with that. We're actually building a version of it aimed only at 80-year-olds. We have a pretty big relationship with elder care communities to do that. And so there are, I mean, the example I showed you was a 50-year-old, but I guess we could have gone through one of the 80-year-olds. It is true. I mean, it is a fact of nature that the earlier you have, the more time you have to modify disease risk profiles and so forth. I mean, there's nothing to do about that. That said, interventions like exercise was a really interesting one. Even if you are in your 90s and frail, it was shown that if you start exercise, you still get benefit pretty much throughout your entire life. Like if you can only curl like 5 pounds, curl 5 until you can do 6, like, so there are things that you can do late in life. It is not as expansive as what you could do in your 60s, which is not quite as expansive as what you could do in your 40s and so forth. That's true.
Hi. I'm wondering if you're going to add looking into parasites in the body, because most people have them. I'm going to say most. It's a high percentage, and I think the medical field is not acknowledging that area. They excrete toxins. They eat your nutrients. They eat your body, and that has a huge effect on your health. And I've even heard that it's been linked to MS and cancers. So I don't know if you're going to add that field to your screening and how that will affect your longevity, but I think it's a huge issue that needs to be looked at. So.
Yeah, I think that's true. Some of those, certainly, if we're talking about ones that are bacteria and so forth, you can see some of these in microbiome tests. That's a little bit of a double-edged sword. We used to have a commercial microbiome test for several years, just in the sense that sometimes people will get really alarmed by small amounts of reads, and there's just error in some of those reads. And so, you have to be at least aware of that. That said, I've had 2 really interesting discussions. One with a guy named Doug Kell some years ago. He used to be the head of what would be the equivalent of the National Science Foundation for the UK. I remember because he came up to me in a meeting and he's like, I'm starting to think all chronic disease is related to some sort of infection of one kind or another, because there's just all this like interesting correlative data. We were part of a group that published a paper that linked Alzheimer's disease with viruses in the brain, for example, which increase risk. That's a controversial area, but interesting. Larry Brilliant, who's here in Marin, who you may know, he's one of our advisors for Healthspan Horizons. Had an interesting conversation with him about this. His claim to fame is he led the team that eradicated smallpox from the earth. I should have him over. He's an amazing guy. And so he, anyway, we've gotten into this, and there are no doubt all kinds of hidden triggers from, pathogenic agents and so forth that are in the body that we don't appreciate as much. The Nobel Prize was given out for this some years ago when it was discovered that ulcers and stomach cancer were really tied strongly to Helicobacter pylori, an infectious agent in your gut. So it's an area that I would say has been underappreciated, in part because it's been really hard to find. And programs like Healthspan Horizons, where we're measuring a lot of those data over time, would make that kind of thing more visible, which is partly what we want to do.
Thank you for this answer. I really appreciate the context that you provided for it. My question is related to your study with the polygenic risk scores. Did you do all of them or just the chronic diseases or the main ones? And my second question is, I read Eric Topol's book on superagers, and I called UCSF and other places, but they only do it for specific diseases and you need a referral. And where do you recommend someone go to find out more?
Oh, yeah, that's a great question. So in the studies we did as many high quality polygenic risk scores as we thought were out there. I know one study we did 54 of them, which we thought passed the right structure and criteria. I didn't include that in the talk today, but we found about 700 molecular correlates in the blood that were potential early warning signs related to all those that were associated with having higher disease risk, which was a pretty interesting area. Yeah, if you want to do, there are places that you can go and get your genome done that I think will do, for the most part, all the validated ones that are out there. There's one company that I like is called Self Decode. And they've got, so you can get a genome done through them. And then, they've got all kinds of different panels that they do, either from wellness or disease or sort of like there's a whole bunch of different menus of the kind of information that you want to pull out that you can get. So that's one place I'd recommend. And I have no affiliation with them.
We have a question from Zoom. Oh. Here's the question. What data or information from wearables are the most informative for long-term wellness?
That's a great question. I'm thinking partly around, what's the most important for wellness and also what's the most accurate. Because I'd be tempted to say that one of the most useful things that you could get is estimates of VO2 max, which is a really important one. But the wearables really vary quite a lot in terms of how accurate they are in that measure. So I would say, some of the really stable things that they do are probably the most helpful. How much time do you spend sedentary? Like the Apple Watch and others, have really keyed into, make sure you get up every hour. Turns out that's actually super important. Like they've done analyses, even if you're exercising, if you then sit for 10 hours a day, you leave a lot of benefit on the table by not doing that. Cardiac zones, right? So how much time do you spend in zone 2, zone 3, zone 4, zone 5, right? You want to spend a lot of time in zone 2, but also have some peak time in zone 5. Like the wearables are pretty informative on that. I have to admit, some weeks I look at that, it's like, wow, I have just sat in planes and done not very much this week. I've finally gotten good about exercising a lot in hotels, but it makes a big difference, right? I think one of the biggest benefits of the wearables, because I find this all the time when people ask, oh, when do you go to bed and when do you get up? And I'll say, oh, I pretty much always do this. And then you go back to your wearables, it's like, hey, you kind of do that. So I feel like they kind of keep you honest in a way of, and it lets you see trends, I think is the other thing, right? Because I think it's pretty hard in your memory to say, have the number of steps you walked every month trended up or down over the last 3 years? I mean, maybe you made a major change in your life and you totally know that. But I think in other cases, I've been surprised where you look and you say, oh, I moved from New York where I used to walk all the time. Now I sit in my car in Marin and drive everywhere. Okay, and I go outside and I try to walk up the hill of the Buck and so forth, but have I trended up or down from the New York days? And I think some of that is, in your own life. I just think that's one of the big useful things is to watch for those just sort of trends, things that you might not otherwise notice.
About 1 or 2 more questions.
Inside a question. What about AI and some of the restrictions with HIPAA and information, and whether some of the medical record information, if the medical record information that's restrictive on HIPAA would feed into the AI models you use, and whether or not some of the outcomes of the Compass research that you're doing with individuals would eventually go into medical records for those people?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. So for people who couldn't hear, first part of the question was about HIPAA. And and with AI systems, do you get HIPAA, data leakage and things of this nature? So one, certainly with what we're building, everything will be done within a HIPAA compliant cloud. I do think it is an interesting aspect of, as you feed the, results and so forth back to the person, they will have access to privileged information, but that will be delivered privately. What happens after that is, I guess, is at the discretion of the individual, but it will all be done in HIPAA cloud. There are very significant penalties to violation of those, as you probably imagine. So there's a lot of thought that goes into how to control that. We're also exploring and we have a white paper online if anyone wants to read it about the Healthspan Horizons program. It talks about federated data models, where we're trying to have sets where you do the computation, but the data actually lives kind of natively where it's at. So you don't actually aggregate it all. And we're trying to get computational methods that will allow us to do that well. And there's a lot of solutions that are being built out there. So that's one. The second part was, what was the second part of the question? It was the
Just terms of the larger data models and whether the Compass information could feed into that in some way.
Oh, right. If we go back into EHRs and so forth. Yeah. So that I think is likely yes in the long run. It will require like different sorts of partnerships and permissions and so forth. So it's not on the immediate roadmap. With a couple of exceptions. So we have a couple of partners that we're working with. I mentioned one is related to senior living communities and so forth. There will be building a version of this that is native and specifically honed for their population. That's going to be part of a whole integrated system that would include EHR and so forth for residents and so forth. So that won't be specifically Compass, but it would be like a solution that we leverage like our know-how and knowledge into what they're doing. So that'll be true. We're also going to be developing a clinical decision support system in the United Arab Emirates. I mentioned we're the first group that's really working from here on the genomes out there. We have a great preventive medicine partner out there in the Institute for Healthier Living Abu Dhabi. And we're going to be developing things there, and that will be very directly tied to the EHR. And then eventually I would imagine we would do something like that here. I've had outreach from many clinicians and many companies that are trying to do that here. And so I think that there's a pretty reasonable chance that we would partner with someone around that. It's likely to be us supporting their infrastructure more than we're porting. Like for people that come in and use Compass, well, one aspect is if we do any EHR, I doubt we connect to EHRs directly there, other than people like bringing in their own EHR data. But writing to EHRs, yeah, I have to be convinced there's a solution that would let us do that, like legally and technologically, like in a simple way. And people would have to give permission for anything like that, obviously. So, yeah.
Here's our last question, and then we're going to have a book giveaway.
I realize you have to use differences when you're doing these studies in people, but have you ever used the difference in women that have had children and women that have not had children? Does that have any effect on what happens to them later on in life?
I'm sure the answer is yes. We haven't looked a lot at that particular question, I don't think right now. We do some related studies. We've got a really large data study on pregnancy that we're doing with the University of Pittsburgh. So we're looking a lot at what happens in women during pregnancy, which is a little bit different. We've got a new study we're doing with WHOOP that's looking at premenopause, menopause, and postmenopause, and looking at relationships there. But we haven't done specifically that I can remember just a focused study on women that didn't have children versus women that did. But it'd be an interesting question for sure. But we haven't done that specifically.
Thank you very much. Can we give Dr. Price another round of applause? ESCOM has a tradition of giving away books for free. And I've been told that I used to always pick the month that we were in and say, who has a birthday this month? And someone said, that's not fair because there are other parts of the year. So I asked our president to pick a month out of his head. And you know what month he chose? June. So who has a June birthday? Okay, you get a free book. You get a free book. And there's a person here who has a June birthday. Right here. And perfect. I always hope there's not going to be a fist fight. All right, and Allison's selling more books at the back. Thank you very much for coming. Have a great day.